Please welcome Dr. Bríd McGrath.
When Ian rang me and asked me what I'd like to talk about, I said to him, I'll talk about Kilkenny's MPs in 1428. And then I got this barrage of replies saying, Bríd, you work on the 17th century. What are you doing talking about the 15th century? And the answer is, I am living dangerously tonight because this isn't my area. But what happened was I used to teach paleography in Trinity, so that's how to read old manuscripts. And I was always looking for good material for my students. And I went into Pearse Street Library and I started reading their copy of the Liber primus Kilkenniensis. And I am like Pavlov's dogs. I am trained to respond to the word Parliament. And there it was on the page. And it gave me the details of Kilkenny's MPs in 1428. Now, none of us knew this. Burchell did a great historical biography of Kilkenny MPs. He doesn't mention them. He didn't know that these two men existed and were elected. And one of the reasons for that was, and Lodge, who had actually produced the best list he could of MPs from everywhere in Ireland, and he actually worked on the original writs of return before they burned in 1922. And he has no reference to it. And the only one who spotted it is Neely in his history of Kilkenny. And I thought, I'd really like to talk about this because it's something we really don't know very much about. But the other thing about it is Neely didn't go into the context. So what I'm trying to give you is a bit about these men, but also about the context of the time, which is very much centred around Kilkenny. So it was unknown until Neely wrote Kilkenny, an Urban History. There's no reference in Burchell. There's this big gap between 1376 and 1560. There's no reference in Lodge, but the information is given in the Liber primus, but it's given in a very curious way. There's no reference to their election or about anything that the burgesses did in Parliament. It's just that they were being paid some expenses because MPs got their wages in those days. They were very good wages. They were brought in England first, and at some point the English reduced the rate, but the Irish MPs never did. Does that feel familiar? Mm. So we don't have any information about the MPs for Kilkenny County, just these two men for Kilkenny City. Just to tell you a little bit about the Parliament at the time. Nowadays we're used, and this is a very topical day for talking about parliaments, really. Attendance at medieval parliaments was erratic and frequently very, very low. And there was one structural reason for that. It was the sheriff of the county who decided who should be invited to send MPs. And he only sent it to people who were likely to be affected, people or places who were likely to be affected by the business that they were conducting. So if it wasn't something that really affected, say, Kilkenny town, then you wouldn't get an invitation to send MPs. And the other thing is, Parliament didn't necessarily have a great reputation. I know it's a day for talking about this, but many areas were intermittently represented. So only when the sheriff got round to sending it to you, and only when you could be bothered, okay, which in many cases was not very often. So the Liber primus, the reason that nobody except Neely twigged was that the Liber primus wasn't published until the last century. So anybody who had been trying to find something, unless they actually went to the original manuscript, and not that many people can read the hand, they couldn't actually know what was going on. And first, Charles McNeill published it in 1931, and then Annette Jocelyn Otway Riven in 1961, as sponsored in those days by Smithwick's. I looked at the manuscript copy in the Gilbert Library, but it was really hidden. It was there, but you had to know about it to be there, and people just couldn't read the hand, didn't know where the material was. So in this Liber primus, there's the only one entry about these burgesses for Parliament, and it doesn't mention any other parliaments, just this one. And it just says in Latin, so thank God for the translation, Walter Sherlock, one of the burgesses elected as the aforesaid Parliament by the aforesaid community for the town, was given for the town by the said Commons to the said Parliament 20 shillings, and Nicholas Sutton elected for the same 10 shillings. So now we know who were the two MPs. They were Walter Sherlock and they were Nicholas Sutton. No reference to the election, just to these payments. Now, we don't really know why they were given different amounts. I speculate later on why that might be, but we don't actually know. In fact, this entry raises far more questions than it answers, but sure isn't that the joy of history? So medieval parliaments, they were held very frequently, almost every year. It's true now. Well, part of the issue was the Anglo-Irish, they were really only to serve the Anglo-Irish community, the lordship. And they accepted English common law and English statute law sometimes. So most of the time they actually spent their time dealing with local disputes and coming up with solutions to rows or to jurisdiction and so on. So very much the judicial function. So unless the subjects to be dealt with particularly interested or affected them, many towns weren't summoned to Parliament. The counties were always summoned, but the towns might not have been. And some of them who were summoned decided they couldn't be bothered sending people. It was going to put them to a lot of expense. Okay, and they, even if they attended one session, they mightn't have attended the others, because Parliament moved all over Ireland at this stage. Well, obviously not into Connacht or Ulster, but it moved around. So you would be summoned maybe to Dublin or to Trim or to Limerick or to Kilkenny or to Waterford. And once when the Lord Deputy was really trying to screw taxation out of them, to a barn in Tipperary, where there were no beds, no food, nothing, just to make sure that they wouldn't stick it out. And they didn't. They caved in immediately and handed over the money. But I know, a bit like the revenue nowadays. Now, what was the context at the time? And the context of the time was that the English king, who was Lord of Ireland, he was a minor, because he was born in 1421 and he inherited the throne at 9 months of age. So obviously he wasn't going to get very involved in anything. But what it meant was the English government, and therefore the Irish one, was administered by a lot of his relatives who had very competing interests and so on. So really, they had very little time to spare for Ireland, because they had so much to be doing in England. But they were here, and they were also distracted by their wars in France, Agincourt and the time of the 100 Years' War. So they were under a lot of pressure to hold the English crown's lands in France. And as you can imagine, there was a lack of direction when it came to Ireland, because it was so low down the list of priorities. We may gripe that we're still way down the list of priorities, but we really were at this point. And the next thing is that there was a feud between the Earl of Ormond, obviously from here, and the Talbots, who, despite their name, they were English, and they were Lord's Deputy here. And the row literally went on for 40 years, 30 years, and neither side was forgiving in. The other thing was there was a rapid turnover of English governors. So they were almost all English, except the Earl of Ormond and one of his relatives, who was the Prior of Kilmainham. But the rest of them were all English. And they were given office for a really short space of time, so there was no continuity in what they were doing. So you can imagine the effect on local areas is very, very tricky at that point. The colony was shrinking because Irish was having a revival, and the colony wasn't doing well because it wasn't very well managed at this point. And they weren't very interested in what was going on centrally. They were really very focused on their own local interests. So there was a decreasing respect for an engagement with the colonial institutions and personnel, although there was still, the views are divided on how well this actually worked out for the colony. If you see here, these are the chief governors appointed in England, and you can see the turnover. Do you see that? The first one, July 1419, April 1420. And they got through all of those in that amount of time. Now, I've highlighted the times that Ormond was, and again, they're very short periods of time. And I've also highlighted his cousin, the Prior of Kilkenny, because all the others were English. And just because they were appointed in December, for example, 1427 to July 28, doesn't mean that, well, Dancy was already here. But for example, Lord John Sutton, third from the bottom, Lord Dudley, that was September 1428 to November 1429. But it took him months to get here. So that wasn't actually the amount of time that he spent in Ireland. It was the amount of time he had the office. So there was very little that you could get done and absolutely no continuity. And the two Talbots, Richard Talbot, the Archbishop of Dublin, and John Talbot, they were brothers. So it was the two of them that actually were conducting this feud with Ormond. What was the role of the Parliament in the colony? It was representing the colony. And what happened, because this feud was going on for so long, both sides kept on appealing to England with complaints about the other side. And then there'd be an inquiry. And it wouldn't get finished because the other person did hear about the inquiry and managed to stymie it. So there was all sorts of back and forth, but it was basically one row after another. So in 1417, there were complaints against Talbot from Parliament, which was then at Trim, and it was to be delivered to the king directly. So not going through, obviously, the person that they're complaining about. In 1421, there were complaints against Talbot and Stanley. In 1429, which is the Parliament we're dealing with, there was a letter in support of Sutton and a counter document from Ormond in which he was explaining his side of the story. And then in 1441, Ormond sends over one, he's presiding over the Parliament, and he sends over a complaint. And then back we come with more complaints. So can you imagine trying to deal with this? I think the English must have been in despair, But they could, of course, have got around a lot of this by actually appointing good men who they left to do the job, but they didn't. So now, which Butler was this? This is James Butler, the Earl of Ormond, and he was circa 1390 to 1452. He was known as the White Earl, presumably from his fair hair. Now, he was very loyal to the crown, but also he had a lot of very, very strong English connections. So his mother was English and his wife was English. And he fought with the English in France at Agincourt and other places in that 40 Years' War before he came back to Ireland. He wasn't the only magnate to cross swords with the Talbots, but in Ormond's case it happened because they invaded his land and seized some of his property. So of course he wanted to get it back. He was ambitious and described as too valuable not to be used, but was often too volatile to be trusted. He was also pretty vindictive. If you got on his wrong side, you would feel it. Yeah. I mean, this always gets me. The Talbot feud was resolved in the time-honoured way by marrying Talbot's son to Ormond's poor, miserable daughter, Elizabeth. Who, I don't know whether it worked or not, but it was a bit like Strongbow marrying Aoife. That's the way you actually get an alliance going. The context of the 1428 Parliament was this continuing tension between the Lord Deputy and Ormond. And Parliament was being used by both sides to prop up their own position. The letter that was sent into England complained that politics had lapsed into mere faction, and that the article sent by the Irish Parliament to England, which was supportive of Talbot, declared that the persons elected to parliaments and great councils are wholly under the influence of the nobility and in no way concerned for the public good. Now, very often there was a view that whatever was good for the aristocracy was good for everybody else, which we wouldn't subscribe to nowadays, but that was rather a view. Ormond was clearly anxious to have as many of his own men in the Parliament to defend his interests, and his influence in Kilkenny city was sufficient to persuade the town to elect 2 of his associates. Now, Sherlock is much more a sidekick of Ormond than Sutton is. We can see from his life and the roles that he had in the Ormond lordship how he was part of that network of administrators that supported Ormond. So the Parliament was summoned to meet on the 5th of November in 1428 in Dublin, and there it agreed a subsidy. Subsidy in these days always meant taxes. They meant parliamentary taxes. And they agreed the payments to MPs. Now, there are lots of things we don't know. We don't know when the election actually took place, but it should have been by early September because it was supposed to be 40 days before the Parliament met. Does that make sense? But we don't know because we've no record. But I'm assuming early September. And they travelled up to it. We have no idea what they did in there, other than support Ormond in terms of those letters. Who was qualified to be an MP? Now, we always hear nowadays about the short 40-shilling freeholders, but in fact, that was only for the county electorate, and that was laid down in law. But the electorate for towns wasn't specified in law, and it left a lot of latitude for towns to decide who was going to elect these people and who wasn't. The modus tenendi parliamentum specified that MPs should be chosen by their communities. The king shall instruct the mayors, bailiffs, provosts of cities and free boroughs that by the common consent of their community they shall elect 2 citizens or burgesses. But they weren't specified in medieval and early modern towns, and towns could change at any time they liked. They could decide, for example, that Kilkenny's structure as a town, they had 24 superior freemen who formed the council. There were 12, and then there were 12. And they could decide that maybe only the first 12 would have a vote, or maybe only the second, maybe they and the second, or maybe everybody else. We have no idea who elected these people. We only know that it was up to them to decide how they were going to do it. And they could change it from one parliament to another because it wasn't laid down. It was up to them to do it. So not all freemen may have voted for these MPs. It could have been just the 24 superior freemen, or it could have been maybe just 12, or it could have been everybody. Now, MPs' wages, they were generous. They were 13 shillings and 4pence per day for a county member. They were 10 shillings for a citizen per day. And the burgesses, so from Kilkenny, because it wasn't a city, it was just a town, it was 6 shillings and 8pence per day. And that was payable while Parliament sat for the whole session, plus 10 days before and 10 days afterwards, and that was to allow for travel. And it was to cover you, your horse, and your servant. Because you couldn't be going without a servant, you know? Not on. But often lower payments were agreed locally. So they may have said, well, Kilkenny isn't very well off at the moment, we'll just take 4 shillings or whatever. But that again is not very democratic because it means that only the wealthier people can afford to do that. So it's unclear why Sherlock received twice as much as Sutton, but Sutton seems to have been much less prosperous than Sherlock, and it may be that he got an advance payment before he went to the Parliament to allow him to attend. We just don't know. You see what I mean about the things we don't know? We can't know. It raises lots of questions. So who was Walter Sherlock? He was Ormond's seneschal in Kilkenny, so the man who did his business between 1420 and 1443. So that's a long, long stretch to be in such an important position, such a pivotal position for Ormond. And in 1425, the Earl granted Tarrow Mill and Magdalen Mill in Kilkenny and the office of Master Miller to him and his wife Rose, there's no question that man was grinding the corn himself. No chance of it. He would have left that out to somebody else at a lower rate and pocketed the difference, because he wasn't a miller. So you weren't allowed to do things that you weren't trained to do. So it does mean that we know that he had a wife Rose by that date, which is what you don't always get. There's a lot of references to him in Curtis's Calendar of Ormond Deeds, really in volume 3. He was a member of Kilkenny Council by at least 1431, and he was sovereign in 1441 to 2. So sovereign is like the equivalent of being mayor. It's just lower down the rankings. Sutton isn't referred to in the Ormond Deeds at all, suggesting that he didn't witness any documents for him. He wasn't one of his administrators. He was probably a merchant in Kilkenny. And he was a member of the council from at least 1431, but probably much earlier. And he was the sovereign in 1431. So I'm theorising that because he's much less identifiably Ormond's client, he may have been the town candidate, and what the town decided to do was to elect one person that was very close to Ormond, because Ormond wanted that, and that the other one was somebody who was for the town. But again, we've no way of actually knowing that that's the case, but it seems to me that that's likely, particularly because he was sovereign so much earlier than Sherlock. So I think he was much better got earlier on with the town. Does that make sense? Yeah. But we can only speculate. Now, there is a pattern of Ormond ensuring the attendance of his men in Parliament, and it goes back. There was a man called Richard O'Hagan, who was Archbishop of Cashel, and he definitely attended the Parliament in 1408 and again in 1421, and probably several others as well. Now, there's always this theory that Irish people weren't in medieval parliaments. This one was, and he wasn't there for decoration. He was a very able and interesting man. And one of the things that he had a copy of the Modus Tenendi Parliamentum, which was the manual for parliaments, and a copy in French. So he clearly spoke English, Irish, French, and Latin at least. But his copy of the Modus actually specifies that it needs to be kept in Cashel because that is the centre of Ireland. Now, I know, it depends on the map you're looking at, but if you exclude Connacht and Ulster, it pretty well is. Do you know? Sorry?
The centre of the colony.
Well, it was part of that, but also part of Ormond's area in Tipperary. So he was very close, not just to Ormond, but also to the Earl of Desmond, who gave him a ring with St. Patrick, with an image of St. Patrick on it, for his concubine. Well, you know, Sherlock and Sutton obviously are part of that pattern. He was accused in 1441 that he returned as county members, grooms and pages of his household of Irish origin. Now, it's not entirely clear whether this is a socio-economic jibe or an ethnic one. But either way, Ormond is ensuring that his men get in. And if that means that they're Gaelic Irish, he's fine with that. But that again raises questions, what language was spoken in Parliament? Because the records were supposed to be in Law French or in Latin. But a lot of the grooms of his household aren't going to have Law French or Latin. So there must have been a lot of interpretation and people who were able to explain what was going on and so on with that. There's limited evidence of other cases, but it's clear that the pattern holds because Parliament, control of Parliament and using Parliament to protect his own position was really important to Ormond because what else was there? You know? And it had a position where it could write to the king in England, who was by now more than 21, and so on. You can read more about this in these articles. Now, you can see immediately whom you should have invited to give this talk, which is Peter Crooks, because he knows so much about it. But what's really interesting is that Margaret Griffith, She wrote about it as evidence that the Irish Parliament wasn't actually effective or working well, whereas Crooks writes about it as evidence that the Parliament was working. So you get to take your pick, which of them you think is right. And this is the documents that were being sent in 1441 to protect Ormond's position. That's all I have to tell you about it, but I am...